You know, some crises, they're not really remembered for what happened, but for the leadership that showed up or, well, didn't. When everything falls apart and people are terrified, leadership becomes the one thing that literally makes or breaks the situation. So we're going to dive into this, looking at one of the most brutal case studies in modern history.
1,800. And that's not just a statistic. That's more than 1,800 people who lost their lives during Hurricane Katrina. And yeah, that's the human cost of the storm itself, but it's also the heartbreaking cost of what happened next, in those days when help was desperately needed and it didn't come.
And that's really the heart of it, right? Katrina wasn't just a hurricane. It morphed into this catastrophic failure of leadership. A truly terrible situation was made so much worse, all because the system that was supposed to help just stalled out, hesitated, and completely fell apart.
The real test, you see, it wasn't the hurricane. It was the storm after the storm. This crisis of coordination, of decision-making that was exploding while the city was still flooding. And believe me, it all happened unbelievably fast.
I mean, just try to wrap your head around this timeline. August 29th, the storm makes landfall. Just hours later, the levees start to fail. By the very next day, a staggering 80% of New Orleans is underwater. Power, phones, roads, poof, all gone. The physical disaster was just escalating at a terrifying pace.
And here's the crazy part, the real paradox. All the pieces for a response, they were there. I mean, you had the authority, you had the resources, you even had boots on the ground. But nothing. The whole system was just paralyzed, and that created this incredibly dangerous leadership vacuum.
So why was that vacuum so devastating? Well, to get it, you have to understand that in any big emergency, leaders aren't just fighting one battle. They're fighting two at the exact same time.
Okay, so on one hand, you've got the physical scene. You know, the flooded streets, the collapsed buildings. That's the stuff you see on TV. But then there's the emotional scene. And trust me, it's just as real, and in some ways, even more dangerous. We're talking about raw fear, rumors spreading like wildfire, and trust just completely dissolving when people feel like they've been left behind. A real leader has to manage both of those at once.
So what happens when leaders drop the ball on that emotional scene? When there's a leadership gap like that, what exactly rushes in to fill it?
Fear. It's really that simple. When leadership is missing, fear and uncertainty just pour into that empty space. And fear, man, fear is like a poison. It kills cooperation, it feeds rumors, and it makes every single part of the response 1,000 times harder.
But then, the story takes a turn. Days into this absolute chaos, real leadership finally shows up on the ground. And we can see crystal clear what changed the second that happened.
This is Lieutenant General Russell Honoré. He was sent in to take command of the military response. Now, here's the thing you've got to understand. He didn't roll in with some brand new secret plan. Nope, he showed up to be a catalyst. His job was to jumpstart the engine of a system that was already there, but had just completely seized up.
And this quote, it became famous because it perfectly sums up his whole philosophy. It was a direct order to his people. Stop waiting around for perfect information. Stop just staring at the problem. Start acting on what you know, right now. It was all about slicing through that red tape and paralysis.
So his approach, it was really simple but incredibly powerful. First off, he was actually there, on the ground, not in some remote office. Second, he set one single, clear priority: save lives. That's it. Third, he basically forced all the different agency leaders into a room to talk to each other, face to face. And finally, he gave them the power to act now, with the info they had, instead of waiting for some perfect report.
Okay, so how do we turn this story into something we can actually use? A practical toolkit. Because let's be clear, the lessons from Katrina aren't just for three-star generals. They're for anyone, any leader who's ever going to face a really messy, complicated problem.
This table really nails the huge shift he brought to the table. See, on the left, you've got that old-school, traditional command style. It's all about maintaining control, making decisions from the top, and keeping information in separate boxes. But on the right, that's integrated leadership. It's about creating a mission everyone shares, working together, and focusing on the big picture outcome, not just ticking off tasks on a checklist.
And here's a simple but man, a really powerful tool for that. It's called the LOL method. Listen, observe, learn. It's basically a mental habit to keep you plugged into what's really happening on the ground. You listen,
Not just to the words, but to what's not being said. You observe, you watch behavior to see where things are actually breaking down. And you learn, you adjust your plan on the fly based on what you're seeing and hearing. This is exactly what Honoré was doing when he was walking the streets instead of sitting in an office reading reports. And this brings us to a pretty uncomfortable truth. You don't just magically rise to the occasion when a crisis hits. Nope. You default to your habits. You fall back on your training and your preparation. You know that old saying, stress doesn't build character, it reveals it? Well, it's true.
Which leads us to the absolute bedrock of any successful response. It's not the fancy equipment, it's not the binders full of plans, it's trust, plain and simple.
Think about it. You can have the most brilliant, detailed plan in the world, but if the community doesn't trust the people in charge, it's worthless. It will completely fall apart. If people don't believe you when you tell them to evacuate, if they're scared of your shelters, if they won't give you information, the whole system just fails.
And this comparison here shows you exactly what I mean. It's a stark contrast. Over on the left, with Katrina, there was this huge gap. The relationships between the official agencies and the community, they were weak to begin with. So when the pressure hit, that bridge of trust just crumbled. Now look at the right, the 2018 Camp Fire in California. It was a horrible disaster, but because those community relationships were already built, the response actually held together. It wasn't perfect by any means, but it was coordinated because that foundation of trust was already there.
And that right there is such a critical lesson. Local community groups, churches, neighborhood leaders, they're not just victims waiting to be helped. They're your partners. In military terms, they're called force multipliers, which is just a fancy way of saying they make the whole effort way more effective. Why? Because they have the local knowledge, and they have the trust of the people, things that outside agencies almost never have. Bringing them into the fold isn't some nice PR move. It is an absolute strategic necessity. So this brings us full circle, right back to the beginning. We have to turn this question on ourselves. If a crisis hit tomorrow and put your leadership under a microscope, what would it reveal? Just remember that phrase. You don't rise to the occasion, you default to your habits, the habits you're building today. So the only real question left is, what are they?